came unplugged at some point and then it reset everything, and of course now it's not working properly, but now it seems to be working, and I can see every time Quibbles says something, I can see it coming up through the desktop audio on OBS, so we should be good. So Quibbles, please restart what you were saying about yourself, just like when did you start streaming, why are you streaming, and that sort of thing.
Yeah, so after the election, I think that both of us, so I co-host the Quibbles Over Coffee show with my friend Houston. I think after the election, both of us were pretty upset. He lives in New York. He goes to SUNY Purchase. He's graduated now, but he did at the time go to SUNY Purchase. I go to Carnegie Mellon, and so I'm down in Pittsburgh in Allegheny County. I was working on the Biden general election campaign, not in any serious capacity, but like somewhat. And I think that we both were somewhat frustrated with the outcome of the election, and particularly with the outcome of the sort of failure of the conservative sort of side of the aisle to recognize the reality that the election did happen. And I think that was sort of frustrating to both of us. And so I thought I think it had the effect of being a catalyst to both of us wanting to create something that would be an ability to get our thoughts out. Okay.
And how long so you said you started in 2016, you said, right?
2020. Yeah.
Oh, you started in 2020. Okay.
No. Yeah, we're very young. We're okay, super young.
Yeah. And is it like kind of like a variety, anything goes kind of show, or is it just like you guys get together and talk about whatever you want? Like what's going on there?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm so I think both of us are more involved in issues to do with land policy than anything else. So I'm a Georgist. I have a background in architecture. I have a minor in architecture. That was actually my major. And so that's sort of what we focused on most heavily. So we've talked a lot about the land value tax. We've talked a lot about carbon dividends. We've talked a lot about sort of progressive policy to do with access to natural resources. It's also true that, of course, we sometimes shit on whoever it might be, the angry conservative of the day. But when we're us in our best sense is, okay, I think, more focused on Georgia's policy.
Okay, and for those that might not be aware of what that kind of policy is, can you explain it for the audience a little bit, basically in your own words, kind of like Georgian policy when it comes to like land use or whatever?
For sure. So Henry George was an economist and a sort of thought leader, whatever you want to call him, in the United States. A little around the same time as Abraham Lincoln. Actually, he was sort of in that world of progressive politics at that time. And so he essentially the basic principle is that natural resources, no one worked to create natural resources. And so we should all have equal access to natural resources. And then at the same time, the sort of flip side of that is that we do on our own, we are individually responsible, solely responsible for the labor that we produce. And so if you think about the value of something as being sort of a multiple of the value of the natural resources that went into it, and the value of the labor that went into it, the value of the natural resource should be the share that belongs to the public, that belongs to sort of, I would call the government essentially an imperfect union, if you will, necessary for representing the people. That should be the part that belongs to us as a collective, and the part that should belong to us as individuals is the part that we're responsible for.
Oh, okay. Sorry. No. So would you say that like I think it's pronounced Pagoy tax, like a land value added tax, is in line with the gorgeous? Is it Georgia? How do you pronounce it?
Georgist. Yeah, no worries. Henry George. Yeah.
Georgist policy, and so it seems like from your basic description of it, it seems like it's kind of trying to make sure that any kind of excess value that's taken out of land, and the whole idea of with Rousseau, that, or was it might have been Locke, I get them confused all the time because I read them both at the same time, but like the first person to put up the fence fucked it up for everybody else, so you have
exactly right.
You kind of have that sense of this was taken from everybody else, so they owe the rest of the people the value that was taken from them from that kind of thing. So
yeah, exactly right. So that's sort of the most, so there's sort of like different thoughts of how far and sort of how radical you want to be about policy. So as you're saying, the land value tax is sort of the obvious one that we could do tomorrow. And that I'm actually sort of working currently in Pittsburgh and trying to get, we already have a partial land value tax in our downtown, but we want to have something that's more across the board. It's only partial and we want to make it across the board and all of it instead of just also, it's complicated, but right now we only get a portion of it is land value tax and a portion of the taxation is a property tax. So property tax gets, I'm not sure if people are familiar with sort of like the basis of this, but a property tax captures the value of both the housing, the infrastructure, as well as the value of the land at equal proportion. So if you can imagine two plots next to each other, right? You have one that's worth $100,000, the plot itself, the land. An additional plot is worth $100,000, the plot of the land itself. But one of these people who owns it is like, okay, I'm going to build a $200,000 house on this, right? So if you're getting 5% tax on the value of both the property and also the land undergirding the property, that means that what you're getting paying $15,000, 5% of that $300,000, and if you have built this infrastructure, if you've aided in sort of building up the community there, and the other person has this empty plot only has to pay a third of that, has to pay $5,000. If you had a land value tax, you'd say, okay, the value of both of these plots of land, the cost to the city of both of these plots of land is exactly equivalent, right? Because you have to get water lines to it, you have to get electricity to it, you have to get all of that stuff is a requirement regardless of whether or not there's actually any infrastructure on it. So what you'd say is instead of having this person pay $15,000 and this person pay $5,000 because they didn't invest in the community, both of them should pay $10,000. And the result of that is, of course, that the person who is built in this infrastructure now has to pay less. And so they say, awesome, that's fantastic. We have an additional $5,000 to invest in the community, an additional $5,000 to invest in, another wing of our house, whatever it might be. And this person who's sitting on this plot of land was going to say, well, fuck that, right? I don't want to sit on this empty plot of land and not do anything with this empty plot of land. It was perfectly reasonable maybe to use this as an investment property and not use it yet, but potentially be able to use it in the future if I'm only paying $5,000 a year. But now that I'm paying $10,000 a year, the only thing that makes sense from a fiscal perspective is either to sell this, which I'm fine with, or to build infrastructure on it. And both of those will result in having more infrastructure. And so if your goal is to have more housing, if your goal is to try to invest in the community, I think it's really crucial to do that.
Yeah, I think a lot of people, like in the community that I help run, a lot of people are extremely interested in the kind of things that we're talking about here. And the thing that I'm sure everybody has seen is like just empty plots of like for sale for lease land all over the place. And it doesn't matter how much development is going on or whatever, people will end up buying the land itself and just sitting on it until such a time that it makes them more money to either sell it or for there to be for them to develop it and then turn over the most amount of profit. With the land value tax rather, you would end up having, like he was saying, you would end up having to pay the not only the upkeep of that land but also an additional tax and stuff. So I think it would Georges agree with maybe a vacancy tax as well, or is that outside of the scope?
Yeah, so vacancy tax is, I would argue, so okay, there's two answers to this. The first answer is, given the society that we're in right now, if I had an option between having the society that we have or having a society of the vacancy tax, I would obviously accept the vacancy tax because vacancy taxes are a way of encouraging infrastructure. I think that we have, in my city, I live in Pittsburgh, so we have enough infrastructure, but our infrastructure is really falling apart in a lot of cases. And so trying to reinvest in that infrastructure, I think is really crucial. And in any context, I think that all infrastructure needs to be improved, whether that means building new stuff or fixing up the stuff that you already have. So yes, vacancy taxes make sense in that context. I don't think that they're as strong as a land value tax because I think that a vacancy tax can sometimes have the effect of hurting places that are in the midst of becoming developed, that aren't developed yet, but are in the midst of becoming developed. And so I think that it's best to just go with a land value tax because I think that's better to be across the board. As a general rule, I want want to make things as equitable as possible, and I don't want to like fix a solution here in this for this facet of society, and then accidentally miss out on another facet of society. And so I think that just having a blanket statement that land value taxation is the better way, I think makes sense. But the short answer is that yes, in the context that we live in, it is still better.
Okay. We actually had a comment coming in from maybe it's me on YouTube that says that the land value tax could work in city or suburb area, yet here in the sticks, which is where he lives, no way it would pass. Is there an answer you have for that kind of critique?
Yeah, for sure. So okay, there's a couple of answers. The first answer is that when you're talking about rural areas, the value of land and the value of infrastructure in both cases is comparatively low, because no shit it is, to in cities. The proportion of the value of property that is in rural areas, that's the value of the land comparative to the value of infrastructure, is higher in rural areas. So the reality is that in most rural areas, unless you happen to be in a very, very wealthy suburb, I mean, I obviously don't know the context of this individual person, but the vast majority of rural areas in our country and across the globe, the vast majority of the value is solely the value of the land already, because this is farming areas. And so, like, you're right that it's not necessarily going to be easy to pass. I don't think this is easy to pass anywhere. I mean, I can tell you it's not easy to pass anywhere. But it's, I think, most important to be done in city areas. But I think it's still nonetheless important in more particularly fiscally struggling rural areas.
And with property taxes, it seems like when land is abundant, so saying like rural America, land is abundant, so land is fairly cheap, where property is scarce. And so it would seem to me that a property tax would actually de-incentivize development within rural America rather than a land value tax. Is that what you would say as well?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the truth is that I think, I mean, like, if you just at its most base level, you can think of a property tax as literally a tax. You're making people pay extra money because they dared to defile your community by investing in it. So, like, unless you literally think that investing in your community, building up new infrastructure in your community is a bad thing, fixing up the infrastructure that you already have in your community is a bad thing, it makes no sense ever to punish people for investing in their community. Like, it just, I think it's just blanketly the incorrect policy. Yeah. And
they're thanking you for the explanation. They're very appreciative of this. I know I don't have a way to show you the chat, but
no. I'm looking at it on my other side of the screen. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
But cool. Yeah.
So, all right. I think that's like your most. I think this is would it be fair to say this is kind of what you're most passionate about, like when it comes to politics?
Yeah. So I think it's fair. So, okay. If I'm going to sort of quantify my most important policies, I think the most important policy in the short term is almost certainly to get a carbon dividend. I think that having a carbon dividend is the only real solution that I see. And this is also the case that Jen Yellen sees, that Joseph Stiglitz sees, that a lot of people who are really understanding the economics of the issue and understand the foreign policy of the issue. I think it makes a lot of sense to think about a carbon dividend from an international perspective, because if you're going to get a climate change solution, getting at a solution at the United States level isn't sufficient, because we're only like, what are we, 20-ish% of the problem, right? And if you want to get an answer to the other 80%, we have to sort of use our economic power to transition the way that other countries are operating. And the carbon dividend is the only solution I've seen. And it's also, obviously, I will readily admit that I'm a Georgist, so I think of it as a good policy from a Georgist perspective as well. Yeah.
For sure. And for people that might not be aware of the primary issue with the whole with carbon in general, is that while the United States has a disproportionate from like a per capita basis, disproportionate amount of carbon or CO2, not CO2, we'll say climate warming chemicals that go into the atmosphere. We're disproportionate based on the amount of people that we have. However, once we can't expect other countries to delay or not do development themselves. Right. And so when places like Nigeria, South Africa, China is still a developing country in many sense. When they raise to potentially where the United States is, you're just having that compound on there. So there has to be an answer for that as well, and maybe the carbon credits is a part of that. Maybe helping communities skip coal as a development resource is another, and that sort of thing as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, carbon credits are a good idea. I think that carbon credits don't quite go as well as a dividend for a couple of reasons. So the first reason is the dividend component, right? I think that if we're thinking about how to pass this, framing climate policy from a vantage point of this is something that's going to hurt us, but we have to accept this sort of pain in the short term in order to protect ourselves in the long term. I think we've tried that pretty clearly. It hasn't worked. And so thinking about framing this carbon dividend around the dividend component, saying that, well, hey, and this is the statistics of the Citizens Climate Lobby. The Citizens Climate Lobby says that it's going to be something like $300 per person per year by 2035 if we implemented it next year, right? So like $300 per person per year is pretty freaking good. Right? I'm not saying it's going to like change your life, but like it would be very nice to be able to have that money coming in to us as Americans. And the math of it seems to suggest that would mean that that's for something upwards of like 85% of Americans, it means that you'd actually get more money, even once you include the tax component of it because of the dividend that's coming back to you. And it's only for sort of the upper echelons of society that are already sort of, responsible for a huge amount of pollution. Mm-hmm. They're the only ones that are actually going to end up being worried about the cost. And it doesn't actually amount to that material of cost, even for them, unless you're talking about like literally BP, oil, or Shell.
Right. Right. And for people that might not know, this is kind of like a prebate. So think of the child tax credit that's coming into people's pockets now over the next year or so. It would be a similar situation where people would get that money over the course of a year, and it's designed to offset the cost of living increases that happen due to the taxes on energy and stuff. So there is incentive because, of course, you're going to profit more from the credits if you reduce your own carbon footprint, but it's designed in such a way to where the poorest of poor people won't be negatively impacted, whereas the people that have mansions that have their lights on 24/7 and things like that, they'll experience it a bit more.
Right. Yeah. And one of the things I think is crucial to think about, when I think about this, I don't actually think about I don't think of this as like sort of like blaming the people who are spending a lot of carbon and spending a lot of and have a lot of climate sort of effects, right? I think of it more in the sense of, okay, like this is everyone's air. Right. And if you're going to use everyone's air and you're going to harm everyone's air in some way, just pay me. Right. At the most basic level, like there's not that much, like it's not sort of like this rocket science, like complicated, wonky, whatever. It's just like, if you're going to use a common resource, you should pay for the common resource in the same way that like you have a water bill, right? If you use the water, you should pay for the water. If you use the air, you should pay for the air. And I there's a lot of complicated economics involved in this, and there's a lot of sort of like jargon and all of but I think that we sometimes lose ourselves in that politics, and we don't just recognize the base level, of course this is yes, obviously this is the correct thing to do. If you use natural resources that you didn't work to create, but that affect other people when you use them, you should pay the other people that are no longer able to use it.
Yeah, and believe it or not, everybody that's watching this, people like Milton Friedman are also very much a proponent of this. All right, moving the screen around. Sorry if it's distracting people, but people, he used the example of, well, you're dirtying my shirt, you should pay for my cleaning bill, because he was a little more well off than others, but that's essentially what it's come to boil down to. But
he's right. He's right. Yeah.
It makes sense, even if you yourself might not necessarily agree with Friedman in general. There was some ideas that he had that were not bad. Stakeholder or shareholder capitalism, minus shareholder capitalism, of course. But okay, I think that explains a good bit of where you're coming from, Jonah. Would you say, as far as like things that you like to do besides podcasting and stuff, can you tell us a little bit more about yourself? What are you currently doing, and what do you do to like relax after a long day of work or whatever? or school?
Sure. So, I mean, I'm a student, so I'm going to be graduating in the fall. So that's mostly what I do. I'm currently trying to figure out what I'm going to do after. So I'm potentially going to work at AmeriCorps. I'm going to be doing an interview there tomorrow to decide if I want to work for Habitat for Humanity. That's one option of what I might end up doing. I've traveled a shit ton, so I probably want to continue to travel. And so I want to figure out if I can do USAID, something like that. I want to do some sort of nonprofit work. And then after that, I'm probably going to end up becoming a lawyer and selling my soul.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Eventually. But that's, when I'm 35. Yeah.
And so you're about to graduate. You're graduating with your bachelor's or master's?
Bachelor's, yeah.
Okay, bachelor's. And so you're like 22?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
All right.
What about you? I'm curious.
I am 35. I don't look it, but I will be 36 in September. I am a data scientist by trade. And so by training, I have a degree in political science with like a focus kind of on international relations and a degree in criminal justice with a focus on substantive criminal law. The plan was to be a lawyer, but I graduated in 2008. So,
yeah.
So everybody knows how that went. Anybody that graduated in 2008 literally had their life put on pause for at least 4 years. So, or at least 3 years, we'll say. So I ended up actually joining the military in 2011, and I was 7 years in the Army. Got out, ended up getting a internship right before getting out with IBM, and then that turned into a job. COVID happened. IBM cut cost, and so I ended up getting laid off, but I would manage to actually find a job fairly quickly. Went back to school a little bit for data science and a coding bootcamp, and was able to do that. So yeah, I'm working now for a pretty large international company and just doing what stuff I like.
Nice. Cool.
Maybe it's me is saying he 100% disagrees with charging for air. We are selling our property in California due to these types of regulations. We decided to be environmental, installed a rainwater collector. Now we have been fined for doing it and estimated water reused. Charging for resources like that is absurd. No offense. I think it's not charging for air, maybe, but maybe Jonah, maybe you could explain it just a bit better.
Yeah. So I mean, okay. So there's a couple of sort of things to think about here. The first thing to think about is that, okay, I live in Pittsburgh. We used to be in a really awful place in terms of our air quality, right? So I'm not sure if you can see it, but across over there's a giant building that's like super, super tall. It's called the Cathedral of Learning. It's part of the University of Pittsburgh. It is this beautiful giant, it looks like a cathedral. It's this beautiful white marble building, right? And for years, for decades even, I have a professor, his name is Doug Cooper. He's been there for forever. And he was my drawing professor. And this is my freshman year when I was an architecture student. He would talk about when he had been growing up in Pittsburgh, and that building was literally black. It was literally black with the soot, because that's how awful the air quality had become. That's how awful the pollution was in the city of Pittsburgh. And the truth is that that's not just a Pittsburgh problem. That's a problem that we experienced in Chicago. That's a problem that we've experienced across the country. And so, it's fair to be concerned about the cost of making people pay for the pollution. And I want to be clear, the majority of the cost here does not fall on small people. It falls majority onto large companies. It does mostly fall onto the Carnegies, onto the Fricks, right? The people who are making a shit ton of money off of doing. Am I allowed to curse? I'm sorry.
Yeah,
a boatload of money.
Oh, okay, cool. Good.
A boatload of money off of the pollution that they're responsible for. That is the majority of pollution. I think that a lot of times we allow I think that big polluters are able to use the fact that small people are affected by climate policy. I think that some climate policy is poorly designed such that it disproportionately affects people who are on the smaller end. So one example of something that I think is like really dumb is like all of this nonsense about like plastic straws. Right? Like plastic straws are a problem. There's no question about it. But like when we think about climate policy, when we think about like the solutions to the problem of quality oceans and quality access to air and all of that, And we think about it in the context of like straws. Like now you're just hitting a bunch of small people who are just like trying to run their restaurant, right? You're not actually fixing the problem. It's something that disproportionately hurts the people who are not actually the problem. You're disproportionately hurting people who are not actually at fault. So I think you're right that there are cases where the policy is really bad, but I don't think that's an argument against policy. I think it's an argument against bad policy.
Okay, I guess that's fair. And to just reiterate a point that I had made earlier, this isn't necessarily paying for air; it's paying for the cost of making air dirty. So, a giant company that is not being environmentally friendly with their we'll say a coal plant or something, not being environmentally friendly with it, maybe it doesn't do any carbon capture, maybe they're not doing any scrubbing properly, stuff like that. They're going to be charged more because they're emitting more, whereas a coal company or a coal power plant or maybe natural gas power plant is going to be charged less because they're not emitting as much. And so by adding this cost that we all share collectively onto the people who are actually doing the harm, you incentivize them to do better. That's essentially how it goes.
Yeah, exactly right.
And so you say that you're about to graduate school, so congratulations. Are you doing it this following year, or you're about going to finish over the summer?
I'm going to finish in the fall. Yeah.
Okay.
So at the end of the fall semester.
Congratulations on that. Good job. Like seriously, not everybody. As much as people say degrees are saturated and stuff, still I think it's only about a third of people actually get them. So you should be proud of that. And you said that, so you're about to finish up school, so you spend some time school, you spend some time podcasting and things like that. Is there anything else that you like to spend your time on? Do you like camping? What else?
I do like camping. Camping's a lot of fun. I haven't camped in a while. I've been a big fan of mini golfing. There's this great mini golf place called Kinesis or something like that in Pittsburgh that I absolutely adore. I used to hate mini golfing, but now it turns out that if you're high in mini golfing, it's like significantly better. But anyway, that's a completely different story. I also do like Habitat for Humanity, and I'm part of Common Ground USA, which is like an organization for land policy. Obviously, it's George's organization. I'm on the Common Ground. I'm on the Council of Georgia's Organizations. I represent a Fierce, which is another organization in that same sort of world. So that's basically what I do. But that's essentially that describes me.
Okay.
No.
Well, I don't really have any other questions for you. If you want to get into what we were supposed to talk about, we can. But if you have any questions for me before then, you go ahead and feel free to ask them. I'm pretty much an open book, man. So
yeah, I'm just curious about this community. So this community is a Facebook community?
Yeah. So the group that originally spawned this podcast had been in existence since, I want to say, in some form, 2013 or so. Do you know Stephen Grumbine of Real Progressives?
I don't. I feel like I've heard the name, but I don't know it well. I'm sorry.
Well, regardless of which, he was the original founder of the group that ended up spawning all the groups that ended up being the larger community that we are. And so he was originally the person that was in charge of the group. There was a falling out. He left on amicable terms. And then there was, of course, anytime you have an online group of people running something, somebody steps on somebody's toes eventually. And so the splitting off eventually happens. Crowdsourced Politics was one of those splits, and then from there another split happened, but we had already started a podcast with that name, and so we kept the name for the podcast but changed the name for the group. Out of the larger community on Facebook with us, there's the original Political Mosh Pit, the Political Paradigm Shift, Crowdsourced Politics, Tribune Commons, Debate Harbor Yacht Club. There's like 5 or 6. There's like 2 other groups or so. And collectively, between all the groups, there's about 5,000 people that all kind of know each other in some capacity or what have you. And so that's how this got started. Yeah.
Cool. That's awesome.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, and it's interesting because I know that people younger than myself have nothing to do with Facebook whatsoever.
Yeah.
I wish there was. I wish that wasn't the case. I still find I've been active a lot more on Twitter lately on the main handle for this podcast, but a lot of the political fights between Gen X and older, and a lot of the disinformation is still happening on Facebook. And if the younger people aren't on Facebook pushing back against that, doing the work in the trenches, quote unquote, of the meme war, you're missing a lot of opportunity to potentially convince somebody that they're wrong, or, you know, at least show them that they're not as overwhelmingly represented in their thinking as is being led to believe due to the people that they're interacting with. So that's one of the things I do. I like to go into groups that, you know, maybe I'm like one of, you know, 10% liberals or something in the group or something like that, and I try to talk to people, and I participate on PragerU. I've gotten that PragerU top fan badge before. That was funny. But yeah, I just try to do stuff like that, and, you know, the podcast.
Yeah, it's interesting because I agree with you. Facebook is probably better on like an advocacy perspective, just because number one, there are people who actually show up to things, and number two, it's sort of like just the way that the actual like UI is set up. It's more permissive of number one-on-one connections than the kinds of nonsense that are happening on Twitter, and number two, it's more permissive of like local advocacy in a way that Twitter just sort of like thrusts all of us into this one giant mosh pit. So you're talking to someone who's in Pennsylvania and another person who's in California, another person who's in Qatar. And so like those conversations can only be so useful from an actual like advocacy perspective. So it's interesting. Yeah, I probably should get more involved in Facebook.
Yeah, it's I mean, it's kind of a shit show. Facebook's been changing so much over the last year. They're doing nested comments like Reddit and Twitter does, and I hate it. It's not how Facebook is designed well for it. So it is taking some getting used to get to used to the new interface and things like that. But yeah, it definitely is something that I think a lot of younger people that are politically engaged, that care about this stuff, should be involved in. I mean, even Vaush has a fucking Facebook page, guys. So come on, go out and like get on there every once in a while, you know, see what's going on with the boomer community.
Yep. All right, should we transition over to Israel?
Let's get to it. Let me go ahead and just change the name of this really quick so that it's changed. You know what? I'll just keep it. Never mind. So
whatever it is.
Yeah, I'll just keep it. It's fine. So just a little bit of, I'm going to go ahead and give a little bit of background about what I think is kind of the pertinent issue to this conversation. And then you can do the same. Essentially, the way I look at it is that while the state of Israel as it currently exists is kind of a natural outgrowth of World War I, World War II, persecution of Jewish people, I don't think that the way that it is administered, especially in regards to how the various occupations that have happened over time since Israel's founding, or how they deal with Palestinians and the way that Palestinians have used land and that sort of thing is very moral. And I'm not saying that, like, I'm not going to go as far as to call it apartheid here. I'm not going to go as far as to say that it's genocide or ethnic cleansing. While, you know, I'm not saying that here. I do think there's issues with Benjamin Netanyahu and some of the Likud party and the further right to him where it comes to that. There is a very permissive idea that Jordan is the Arab state, so they should all move to Jordan. And I don't find those kind of things helpful, or even really a way to ensure that the Palestinian quote unquote conflict would actually get resolved. I think it would just turn a internal struggle into an international incident if we were to kind of do these kind of things. So that's the big broad overview of how I'm looking at this. We can get into particulars, but I wanted to make that clear on the outset, and you can go ahead. Yours as well.
Yeah. So my basic, okay. So I sort of look at this as a sort of, from a more zoomed out perspective, I think that a lot of people do. So when I think of Israel, I think that we're missing a large part of the conversation if we just say within the confines of Israel, even if you include Gaza and the West Bank as part of that conversation. I think that the real conversation is a conversation of, you were saying, and I think you're right that this is sort of an outgrowth of the persecution of Jews both in Europe and in the Middle East. But I think that it pretty literally was an ethnic cleansing of all Jews in not just all of Germany or Poland, but also all of the Jews in the vast majority of Northern Africa and the vast majority of the Middle East as well. If you look at the number of Jews, just go by country by country by country, that lived in Egypt, that lived in Ethiopia, that lived in Iran, that lived in Syria, whatever number of countries you might think of. From 1900, and then you look at the number of Jews that are in those countries today. In many cases, they were literally more successful in wiping out their Jewish population than the case of Germany, of Nazi Germany. And so I find it very, very concerning to me when we focus. And I think it's valid to be concerned about the many people who have struggled on the Palestinian side within the confines of the borders of this very small nation the size of New Jersey. That's a valid concern, but I worry and it confuses me when that is the only part of the conversation and there's no conversation about the ethnic cleansing of Jews from across the entire region.
I think that's definitely valid. I think we'd have to take like several steps back to kind of untangle this kind of conversation. So Zionism is a thing that started mostly secular. I am being very brief here, everybody. So this is not in any way possibly comprehensive. That would take like 8 hours, 5 videos, like not doing it. So I'm going to try to make it as succinct as possible. So Zionism is based more or less an outgrowth of secular Judaism, and a people without a land without a people kind of thing, that they were looking to go back to their ancestral homeland in order to set up a state where they would be free from persecution. And the way that this was done primarily prior to the Palestinian Mandate in 1920s is that this was done by Jewish people raising money and buying land from the Arabs and other kind of ethnicities that occupied, not a good term, that were living on the land and owned the land up until that point. Fast forward to 1920, 1930s, in between those time periods, after World War I, the British Mandate for Palestine had promised a Arab Palestinian state, and then World War II happened. We all know what happened. World War II, ethnic cleansing, genocide, etc. And then after World War II, everybody in Europe was like, well, we don't want to have another problem here. We want to make amends for the things that we all participated in, because everybody was persecuting Jews. Like, it wasn't just Germany, it was like it spread all across Europe. So we're going to create a Jewish state in what had been promised to Palestinians under the British Mandate. And what
to clarify, it was also parts of it were also promised to the Jews, right? They had made dual promises that were in opposition to one another. But yes, go on.
Yeah, so that is true too. So fast forward and not fast forward. So as Quibbles was saying, or Jonah, sorry, as Jonah was saying, there was dueling promises, and the Jewish people essentially won. And from my perspective, what had happened was that a large majority of the Arabs either boycotted or were not given any kind of say in how the state would be administered and ran. And that's when Arabs, being anti-Jewish as they are, or not Arabs, Muslims, the different countries, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, etc., came in and said, no, we're going to stop this. And that's what caused the war and conflict that we have today. After the Israeli Jewish people won the war, they ended up taking more of the land from Lebanon, Egypt. Was Jordan was a broker, so I don't think Jordan got land taken from them. Am I correct on that?
Depending on what your views on what happened in the West Bank are. The West Bank, there was a time when the West Bank was, I mean, the reason it's called the West Bank is because it's the west side of the Jordan River. So there was the West Bank part of Jordan, and there was the East Bank part of Jordan. So what we think of as Jordan now is the East Bank component of Jordan.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
So everybody got involved, everybody lost land, and Israel expanded its borders. But within that, there ended up being issues with how the Palestinians were being treated and how much land they would have administered. Fast forward, 50, 60 years later, there's been tons of conflict, land rights issues, occupations, additional wars, additional terrorist attacks from the occupied Palestinians, and that's where we have the conflict today. To untangle all that mess, you have to go back all the way back to the 1800s, which is what I tried to do, and then also go into where the state of Israel was founded and how much, say, the then native population was given into that. I don't know all the in particulars of that. I wasn't there, so I don't know what promises were made behind closed doors. I only know what I read. And while I've read extensively, even to me, it's a little complicated, but it seems on my position that they were ignored. Or whatever.
Yeah, I think that okay. There's a couple of things that are going on. The first thing that's going on is, okay, the British had like no standing to be there in the first place. I think we can grant that, right? Okay, so the British were like a colonist, organization that was controlling. I mean, this is not like a good thing that the British had control of this population to begin with. That's the first thing that's going on. The second thing that's going on is that they didn't give a shit about the local population there, and they also didn't give a shit of what was going to happen after they left. Right? Essentially, they were desperately poor because they had spent all of their money fighting in Europe. And I'm not knocking them at all for fighting in Europe, obviously. But like that is what their primary concern was. So they were willing to lie, cheat, and steal and tell anyone whatever they wanted to hear. And basically they were like, yeah, whatever. This is essentially the same reason that this huge problem was happening in India, Pakistan, and continues to this day to be happening in India, Pakistan, for the exact same reason, which is that the UK just recognized correctly that they could no longer be a colonist state. It was no longer financially made sense to them. It no longer made military sense to them. And so they just stopped. And they made a bunch of promises they couldn't keep. So I don't think that I hold those promises to be that serious, quite frankly. What I do think is important is I think that what you were describing as Zionism, I think that's a modern interpretation. It's a Likud interpretation. It's an interpretation that in many ways is in line with sort of the Bibi Netanyahu kind of world and the right-wing Zionist sort of structure. But when I think of sort of my version of left Zionism, when I think of Zionism, I think of essentially, I think of Israel as a refugee state of return, right? I think of this as a place where all of these Jews who I think reasonably you can say had to leave Europe rather. All of these Jews who I think reasonably you can say had to leave Northern Africa, had to leave most of the Middle East, were forced to return to this place. And it's not even really about whether that place is going to be a government. It's not certainly about how that government functions. It's just about the fundamental need for these refugees that fundamentally do belong to this nation, fundamentally. And by nation there, I mean the land, I mean the people. I don't mean like a country. Because we belong to this place in a very fundamental and a core way, I think that we have an obligation and a right to return to that land, particularly when we have no other real options. So I don't think it's really about government.
I don't think you can disentangle the two. I understand what you're saying because nationhood is more complex than government. It is ethnicity, language, territory. I think there's the three big ones to define a nation from an anthropological sense. Mm-hmm. But again, it buttresses up against the issue of what about the people that live there that are suddenly seeing settlers come in and then setting up their own governments on land that once used to be either kept in common or was for whatever, or either kept in common or was owned by a family next door, what have you. Not going to get into the particulars. And then having this kind of for lack of a better term, colony that setting up in their backyard, what are they going to, how are they going to act? How is any
Yeah.
people going to act to that? We've seen it throughout history when Greeks went to Egypt, they set up their own colony states within Egypt, and then there was tensions there. I think this is just what happens when you have, not two cultures, but this is what happens when you have things changing rapidly without the input of people that get a say into it.
Yeah, so there's sort of a couple of things that are going on. So okay, I'm not sure how familiar you are with kibbutz. Do you have any background with them?
That's the essentially the communes that Jewish people set up. Yeah, I know.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so essentially, there many of them were set up prior to the founding of the country of Israel, and these are people who bought the land. Rightly bought the land, right? There's very little dispute about whether or not they bought the land from the people who had lived there prior to them. These are people who had nowhere else really to go. These are people who were pretty desperately impoverished for the most part, and were very hardworking, who were managing to make, in most of these cases, literally places in the desert, places that had never had farming for well over 1,000 years, into some really impressive farms, and were able to survive doing that. When I think about a commune like the kibbutzim, I think of that as sort of the quintessential, the perfect version of the Zionism that I'm describing. It's a version of Zionism that, yes, it's buying up the land, but I think that fundamentally, like, we as people should have the right to buy up land. We as people should have the right to live in places, regardless of whether or not the people more broadly in the country thereof want us to be there. It's about whether or not we have a right to be on that plot. It's not a question of whether or not every single person in the entire country consents to you being there. Because I got to tell you, if the requirement for Jews to live in a country is that every single person in that country has to like us, we're not welcome anywhere, right? Because, like, obviously I'm in Pittsburgh, and so I was 1.5 miles away from Tree of Life when that happened. Even in America, which is one of the two countries that has been consistently safe for Jews post-Holocaust, even in America, there are a lot of people who really don't like the Jews that much. And so, I'm opposed to segregation at a generalized level. And part of opposing segregation is to oppose, stopping people, quite literally, from being able to plan. Proof that we achieved during the civil rights movement of our country was that we said that, listen, like, you don't get to have a whites only neighborhood. Like, I'm sorry, but the price is the price, and you can set the price however you want to set the price, but you don't get to set a different price for black people than you set it for white people. And it really concerns me when a lot of places, both in the West Bank and crucially in Jerusalem, try to stop people. Try to stop other people from selling to Jews, and try to themselves sell only to Palestinians, but not to Jews.
I don't disagree with the notion that people have a right to buy land. My issue is whether or not that right extends to people buying up a sufficient. Why does it keep doing that? Okay, I gotta fix my bots. But my issue is whether or not that, if they buy up a sufficient plot of land, are they able to then establish their own government in that area? So, for example, let's say the Chinese government officials and princelings buy up more and more property in the United States as currently is happening, and for whatever reason they decided to, let's say they find a huge plot of land in Arizona. I don't know. I'm just pulling stuff out of my ass. And they end up buying enough land in Arizona that they can set up their own government. Do they have the right to establish a colony within the United States? Now, I'm not talking about a ethnic ghetto, and using ghetto here as the actual term where it's a like, you know, talking like this is me clarifying for the audience. So, you know, talking Italy, little China, little Tokyo, not talking about stuff like that, but like an actual government colony state that is separate from the U.S., has its own laws and regulations within, contrary to what the rest of the people therein want, and in that's against essentially what has been going on for, we'll say, like 100, 200 years. Like, is that something that should be allowed? I don't think it is something that should be allowed. I believe in democracy, and that doesn't mean that a small population of people can go in and tell other people what to do just because they have more power.
So I want to make sure I understand the context that you're proposing here. So the proposal is that not the Chinese government, but a number of Chinese people are coming in, and let's actually not use China. Let's use Mexico, just because it's next to the border, and I think it's fair we want to make this a bordering country.
Great. We're gonna end up having all the "you can't come and take our jobs" people getting mad at us. But
right. Let's propose that on the Mexican border, the Mexican-American border, there are a bunch of Mexicans, and this is a time when there was an open border. There was an open border. Let's propose that a bunch of Mexicans buy up at market value the land that is close to the border. And for context, in the case of jumping back to Israel-Palestine, upwards of 90% of the people, of the Jews who are living in the West Bank, are living within a mile of the border, right? So yes, there are examples like Efrat that are much more inland, much more far deep inside of the West Bank, but the vast majority of Jews are very close to the border. So it's not like they're, you know, it's not like they're in Kansas, right? They're like right across the border in Texas. They're right across the border in New Mexico. Okay. They're going to buy up a bunch of land, and they do that at market rate, and everyone's okay with it. And then the result of that is that now there is a city that is directly across the border that is now 90% Mexican, and those Mexicans desire to be part of Mexico rather than be part of the United States. I don't know why I'd be opposed to that.
I'm thinking. So it creates different kinds of problems, right? So we already see, I'm not saying this is something we should be concerned about because people are stupid. So let me clear the air there. But it creates problems where you have these kind of governments being set up. And you know, I'm just going to end up repeating myself, so I'm not going to bother. I am not comfortable with that idea because it's not because I don't want people living next to me. I don't want people that come in and not, that's what it is. It's an anti-assimilationist argument here, I think, for me. So I am pro-assimilation because people have the right to not keep things as they are per se, but they have the right not to be quote unquote overran. And this is getting problematic. I know it is. So, but it's more along the lines of a small minority of people do not have the right to impose their will on a large majority, just like a large majority doesn't have its right to impose its will on a small minority when it violates human rights, violates civil rights, and that sort of thing. And
I'm a bit lost. Go for it.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm just a bit lost. Whose rights are being violated when land is being bought up?
Not when land is being bought up, it's when the government is getting established. Land being bought up is fine. It's when the governments are being established, because once the governments are established, they can then themselves go through and change the rules of the game, change the rules of the game to benefit themselves. And since they have capital, money, power that might not necessarily be as evenly distributed or what have you, then they are able to craft those rules and regulations, especially if they're the only ones setting it up, to meet their benefit. So here's a good example. So when colonists from England and Belgium colonized South Africa. Originally, they went in, bought up land, and started developing it, and traded with people directly within South Africa. The South Africans were then basically becoming a landed gentry because of the trade and their ability to utilize the new tools, and they're already familiar with the land, and so they started to build wealth and became a small middle class. Started hyper not industrializing, but hyper modernizing comparatively to what they were. Now the people, the Belgians and the English settlers, decided that would eat into their ability for cheap labor, and so they ended up passing a ton of laws to where you could only own so much land as an African. You could only sell so much land to Africans and things like that. I'm not saying this is what Jewish people did, but these are the kind of situations that can arise when you set up a government that doesn't take into account the people that are already there.
So I'm a little lost. So the reason that we need to stop Jews from being able to access land tenure,
it has disassociate Jewish people from this. This is a So I understand the problem that you're proposing here, and I think it's a valid one. That when I'm hesitant to say new populations, because they really aren't new populations. These are populations that have lived there for thousands of years. That predate Islam. Yeah, they predate Islam, but anybody. So this is another issue that a lot of people don't take into account when they talk about these things. How many hundreds of years were between Jewish people returning to Israel in mass due to Zionism and their exodus? Like, how many hundreds of years were between those two points?
Why is that relevant?
Because you have hundreds of years of history of what the other people were doing there, and that can't be ignored either. So
if I steal your wallet and then 20 years passed, is it no longer your wallet?
But is it the people that live there now's problem that your wallet got stolen?
No. I'm asking if I Jonah steal your Cypher's wallet,
okay,
and then 20 years pass.
Like I get what you're saying.
My point is that, like, land is obviously, I think, much more fundamentally important than a wallet, right? But I think that if I stole your wallet and then 20 years pass, I think it would still be your wallet, and I think it would still be reasonable to expect that it be returned to you, right? And now, to be clear, in the case of the land, I think that it is, I'm not saying that there's no Muslim claim on the land. I'm not saying that there is no reason that Palestinians belong in the land, but I think that it's crucial to recognize that, that we have been forced out of Israel, and then forced out of the places that we were forced out of Israel to, thereby forcing us back into Israel. I'm reticent to say that when we've already been clustered into I guess I use the word ghetto here, forced into a ghetto the size of New Jersey, that we should cut off the West Bank, that we should cut off, a crucial component of Judea and Samaria, a crucial component of our ancestral homeland, when we've already been forced to such a small space from where we used to be just 100 years ago.
But it wasn't just 100 years ago. We're talking at least 400 years, aren't we?
No, I'm saying we, 100 years ago, the diaspora of Jews existed in, we can pull up the documents, right? Like the number of Jews that lived in Egypt was like 50,000 100 years ago. Now it's literally less than 50, right? So, like, that is an ethnic cleansing. There's no getting around the fact that it's an ethnic cleansing.
It is.
Similarly of Jordan, similarly of Syria.
I will 100% give you that. This is for the audience's benefit. So this happened after I get my wars mixed up. It was the first war that happened between the Israeli Jews and the Arab world that they won, officially established the state of Israel.
1948.
As a response to that, Arab countries, Egypt, North African countries decided that they didn't want Jews living in their countries anymore, and then they mass expelled them as retaliation against these things. Similar to, I would say, probably with similar ideas that they would be loyal to Israel and it would be colony states, similar to why the Americans interned the Japanese. I'm not justifying it. I'm explaining it here. So don't clip me. But yeah,
the one thing I
wanted to clarify.
Yeah, the one thing I'd push back on that clarification, it is true that a lot of, in particular in the case of Egypt, a lot of that forced ethnic cleansing was prior to 1948. There was a lot of force out during the same time as World War II, during the same time as the Holocaust, and this is prior to the 1948 war. But broadly, I think that most of what you said there is fair.
So that just was a point of clarity for that. So it does have an impetus, and it is going to be, I don't find it to be just, because I don't personally think that you force out a people from a place that they've been living for hundreds of years, maybe even in some of these instances thousands of years, from their homes, just because you got beat in a war or what have you. It does have an impetus though, and so it has to be mentioned that was in response to a thing that happened. I'm not justifying it. Yeah,
I'm not sure if that is something that needs to be stated there. I mean, like that's the equivalent of saying that, like, it would be the same as suggesting that Christians are responsible for something awful in Nigeria, and therefore it is necessary for India to respond to that.
It wasn't at all necessary. I'm not at all justifying it. I am just putting a point of so people understand why this thing happened. It's a why. It's not a justification.
Okay, I guess I can. Yeah, it certainly was part of the thought process. If that's what you're saying. Yeah. Okay. I guess that's fair.
I'm trying to be as clear as I can. I'm sorry.
Yeah. It's a hard. Yeah. No, that's fair. It's a difficult.
Know that a lot of people don't know all this information, so that's why I'm giving as much information as possible. So I think so. Okay. I kind of got lost there for a minute. What were you saying?
Yeah. So what I was saying is that I think it is absolutely reasonable to be concerned about the, I mean, as an example, what's happening in Sheikh Jarrah. A lot of what's happening in Sheikh Jarrah is just unacceptable, flatly unacceptable. I do think that it's fair to be genuinely concerned about any development. I mean, as a general rule, I'm very much pro-development. We were just having a conversation about land value taxation for this exact reason. But if there's any place in the entire world, in the history of the world, that it makes sense to say that you can't just like make new developments willy-nilly however you want, and that there are like historical reasons why this particular plot of land is like very important from an architectural perspective, very important from an archaeological perspective. It is Sheikh Jarrah. It is the old city of Jerusalem. And so like, because of that, I'm very concerned when people are just building new wings to their houses just willy-nilly. But nonetheless, when you build a new wing to your house willy-nilly, even if it is willy-nilly, I don't think that's an excuse for half of the for that new part of the home to be gifted to Jews who will now be living alongside you. I think that's inappropriate. But simultaneously, it scares me when there is both a desire and also seemingly a sort of international defense of the desire among Palestinians to stop Jews from living in East Jerusalem, from living in the old city.
So do you understand where some of the, absent the rank anti-Semitism that permeates these conversations as they tend to do, because again, Jewish people are still very looked down upon by a variety of different people for a variety of different reasons, none of them legitimate. So absent of that, do you understand where some people might be coming from? Do you have an idea of why people might be defending this? I just want to know your perspective.
Yeah, so I think that there is a very good reason why Jews are concerned about access to the Temple Mount, and there's a very good reason that why Muslims are very concerned about access to the Temple Mount. So the Temple Mount, for context, is Al-Aqsa. It's the Dome of the Rock. That's the part that's on top, but then that's literally right on top of the Wailing Wall, the most crucial component of for Judaism. And so, when we think about that, I absolutely understand why there are people who are willing to die, willing to kill, in order to protect the view to Al-Aqsa, the view to the Wailing Wall, the view to the Temple Mount, the view to the Old Temple. I understand why this is something that is extraordinarily crucial. This is not a matter of, a lot of land, particularly in the United States, can be thought of as a commodity. It can be thought of as something as an exchangeable good, right? I have an apartment that I'm living in now. I will live in a different apartment in a month and a half. I'm okay with that. This was a fine apartment. I had a wonderful time here, sure. But if I were offered an equivalent apartment across the street that I had to pay half the rent on, I would take it in a heartbeat. That is not the case of the people who are living in the old city of Jerusalem. And so I understand particularly not just the ethnic component of this, but the religious component of this, why people think it matters that Sunni be there, why people think that it matters that Shia be there, why people think that it matters that Jews be there, particular sects of Judaism, particular sects of, I completely understand why that's crucial. And it's not even just a Jewish and Muslim conversation. This is a Christian conversation. Shoot, what's it called? The Christian cathedral that's in the East Jerusalem. I'm totally blanking on its name, but there's like totally fine. But there's the point is when I was there, one of the fascinating things that I saw is the Holy Sepulchre. That's what it is. There are literally like 10, 15 different churches that each own this much space, literally like this much space within the Holy Sepulchre. But this is a crucial component. This is the most important component of their entire sect within Christianity. And there are millions of people who find it crucial that this individual room be maintained, not the building, the individual room, this individual half of a room be maintained for this particular sect. And so I really do understand why it's something that people care about, that this be maintained as Muslim spaces, that this be maintained as Jewish spaces. I get it. But I don't think that changes the fundamental principle that I have, and that's the fundamental principle of opposition to segregation. I don't think that you can say from a legal perspective that this is a Muslim land or that this is a Jewish land and that the other is not welcome.
Okay, I can agree with that. I am what I would consider a radical. What is the what's the opposite of segregation? Integration, radical integrationist. In that regard, I think that all these movements that aim to segregate people based on race, ethnicity, nationality, language, what have you, is counterproductive to the progress of humanity, and that is where I come in, and that's my globalism coming out of me. It's globe gain, not really, but that's what. That's me. That's where I come from in this regard. So I don't think. And this is kind of like this is kind of where our conversation started to like deviate online, and we're getting talking past each other while we do this. Is like, I don't think that a Jewish state or a Palestinian state, ethnicity supremacist state should exist in regardless of how a two-state, one-state solution is maintained, or whatever, not maintained, but is comes out of this. But it seems as though that both sides of the now conflict in Israel both want that to be the case. They're either there's people on the Palestinian side that don't want Jews anywhere inside what they consider Palestine. There's people on the Israeli side, Israeli Jews, that don't think there should be Palestinians on either, and then it's split up. It doesn't seem like there's any integration people in power there, and they just want, and they're like, well, we have two states instead of that, so that all this problem would go away. And I don't agree with that either.
Yeah, so I'd push back on that a little bit. So the first thing that I would say is that Okay, I mean, like, I can just lay out some statistics here. The number of Muslims living in Israel-Palestine, the totality of Israel-Palestine, in 1947 was 1.18 million.
Okay.
Now, today, just in Israel proper, which doesn't include Gaza, does not include the West Bank, just in Israel proper, there's 1.62 million.
Do you
right?
do you happen to know the population percentage breakdown between the growth?
Yeah, I don't know what it was in 1947. I do know that today that Muslims represent 17.9% of this is according to the CIA World Factbook. If you want me to drop it in the chat, I can happily do that. Yeah, so this is from the modern statistics on it. I don't know if you can pull this up on your screen for the audience, but that's the number today, and the answer is 1.62 million as of 2019, which is 17.9% of the Israeli population. And then this is the it's an archived piece, but hopefully you can still see it. But that's the number, which is 1.18 million of Muslims living in Israel-Palestine in 1947, the totality of it. So the number of Muslims has increased, and it's also worth pointing out that in the current governing majority of Israel, there are two parties, arguably. I mean, what's it called? The something list, the Arab list, something like that. But they are like 4 or 5 parties hypothetically, but we'll call it two party because that's what it really is. There's two parties in the governing majority right now that are both Muslim majority parties. And so the idea that Muslims aren't welcome in Israel, I think just the numbers on the ground just don't back that up, in the same way that the numbers on the ground really do back up the statement that Jews are not welcome in Egypt, Jews are not welcome in Somalia, Jews are not welcome in Ethiopia, Jews are not welcome in Jordan or Syria. Oh, I can drop them in the other one in the chat.
No, I dropped them I dropped the links. I can set it up, but it was distracting me from the point.
Yeah, no worries. That's fine. No worries. That's fine.
I don't know if that really matters when you're talking about the morality of a situation that's happening. I think you can disassociate what is happening in other countries from what is happening within Israel. And so I'm not entirely sure if that argument tracks to me.
So the reason that I think it tracks is if we're to think of Israel as a refugee state, if we're to think of it as, and this is, I think, historically accurate, a huge proportion of the Jewish population literally escaping the Holocaust, literally escaping ethnic cleansing across the entire continent of the Middle East and across Africa. Refugees as a okay. This is not well, I guess I'll just say it. As a general tendency, and I have some degree of experience with refugees. Refugees are pretty conservative in terms of their desires. So like when you have experienced a lot of pain and a lot of suffering, you get very hyper focused, hyper vigilant on your own protection, and to an extent, you get concerned about your own protection to a degree that is not entirely inclusive of the non-you, right? That whatever the you that was persecuted is, you become focused on that. And so when we look at the voting of Cubans, for example, in the United States, if we look at the voting of and this is not just true of Israel, this is across the board. People become very insular. And so I think that the reason that I bring up what's happening in Egypt, what's happening in Somalia, whatever it might be, is because that is the thought process that's going through in the heads of so many people who were escaping those places. When you are escaping and you know what it looks like to be in a Muslim majority country, I don't think it's crazy to be concerned about Muslim majorities. And when
I
you're
think
when you're
that's
escaping,
that ends up just justifying racism. Okay, so here's
no. I'm not justifying. I'm
not
just
saying
explaining.
you are.
Yeah,
I'm not saying you
yeah.
are. I'm saying that the mentality that this has is. I'm not okay for clarity for the audience sakes and for the VOD. I'm not saying that you yourself are justifying racism. I'm saying this kind of mentality ends up justifying racism.
I agree.
So
I agree.
let me give you an example of somebody that I've met that I knew in real life. I was in the military with this guy who came of age, not really came of age, but maybe came into awareness of racial differences during the end of apartheid in South Africa. He is a racist ass person against black people. He has a justification for that because he said that he saw what happens when black people end up taking over and how much stuff that they themselves end up doing to other people. And he's just a racist piece of shit, in my opinion. Like, that's what it boils down to. Like, I think this guy is he's just looking for reasons to justify his own bigotry. And anytime that a black person would mess up in the military or he would have to mentor somebody and they didn't do something quite right, he's like, see, you can't trust these people. And I don't like that. I don't like that mentality. I think it's broad brushing people in general. And I think that if that kind of mentality is brought over to a government, then you end up having a government that ends up instituting supremacist kind of laws. Or so you say that you view Israel as a refugee state, okay? But the Israelis, or at least the conservative Israelis, do not. Or if they did, they would allow Palestinians the right to return, but they don't allow the Palestinians the right to return from the various wars that happen because they are very worried that Israel will lose its Jewish majority population, and therefore they will end up being voted out of power and end up being slaughtered, is what they're looking at. And that's just bigotry. That's a generalization. That is projection. Like, that is all these things that we wouldn't accept in the United States or any other Western country. So we shouldn't accept it when it happens in other countries.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. I think that is entirely accurate. The reason I'm bringing this up is I think that just as a fact of the matter, not as a value judgment, but as a fact of the matter, there are a lot of Muslims who, for good reason, are concerned about Jewish majority state, about the Jewish majority state, because, particularly in the case of Gaza, but even in the case of West Bank and in Israel proper, there are real concerns that Muslims do have to experience in the context of Israel-controlled areas, and they're not crazy for being concerned about that.
For sure.
And I similarly don't think that Jews are crazy for being concerned about a Muslim majority state, because they know what Jordan is. They really do know what Jordan is, and they really do know what Egypt is, and they really do know what Assad Syria is, and what ISIS Syria is, even worse, right? So like, I bring this up because I think that there's a lot of people in the West who approach this from a very utopian perspective of, I just want a one state. I just want everyone to just kumbaya, live in harmony. And so do I. I wish that was possible. But having been to Bethlehem, I spoke to the Secretary General of Fatah when I was on a perspectives trip. I've spoken to the Vice Mayor of Efrat. These people do not agree, and they will not agree in my lifetime, frankly, ever. And putting them in a single country, is it possible? Maybe, but I don't know why we would want to. I don't know why it makes sense to make this one country. I don't know why it makes sense to have this be because if it's one country, it's going to be a Muslim majority or Jewish majority. It's not going to be this sort of that those barriers stop existing. Those barriers will continue to exist within the perceivable future. And so what I'm concerned about is not about trying to get to a point where those concerns go away, because I don't think that's possible, but rather getting to a point where both that nation that is going to be created, that is Jewish majority, and that nation that is going to be created, that is Muslim majority, are welcoming and accepting, and at the very least, not actively persecuting the other.
I think what will end up, and this is my concern because I've seen it with other split countries, because we've had a lot of examples of that happening. Pakistan, and India, Bangladesh, Kashmir. That's one set. Eastern European countries that were multi-ethnic, splitting up into individual ethnic countries. Bosnia Herzegovina, Albania, Kosovo, like all these countries that ended up splitting from these multi-ethnic things into ethno states, or not ethnic supremacy.
Not ethno states. Ethnic majority states.
Ethnic majority states. That's a
majority Muslim, majority Jewish. Yeah.
Yeah. The ethnic majority states, they ended up creating international problems rather than it being. I mean, of course, Israel is an international problem, but they ended up creating wars that were cross borders rather than internal. So I don't see that creating a Arab majority country out of some configuration of Israel and maybe some other countries, and then a Jewish majority country will allow that to simmer down. I see that as creating tensions of people like, no, we want it all, so they end up going to war for all of it, and just having a better base to build from there.
So let me ask you this question. Do you think that there is going to be a point where the Temple Mount is not controlled by Muslims or Jews?
Do I think that the Temple Mount is... I honestly don't know how to answer that question. Probably not, unless you create Jerusalem as like some international administered block.
That just means Christians. I mean, let's be real. If we're saying the UN, what we mean is America, we mean the Christians. Sure, let's be real. That's what we mean, right? I don't look at it. I'm not knocking that.
The reason
I'm not knocking that universally, but like, if we say the UN, we mean Germany. That's a problem. We mean the UK. That's a problem. Less of a problem than Germany, but it's a problem. That we mean the United States. We mean NATO. Like we mean NATO. That's what we mean essentially. And so we mean the Christians. So like, I'm like, I've been both to the top of the Temple Mount, and I've been to the bottom of the Temple Mount, and I'm not allowed to pray on the top of the Temple Mount. I'm not allowed to pray there, even though it is literally the most crucial component of Judaism, right? And no Jew is allowed to pray on the top of the Temple Mount because it is controlled by Muslims. And so I don't see a solution there. Like, there's never going to be a point where there isn't some proportion of Jews who don't want to rebuild the temple. There's never going to be a point where there's no proportion of Muslims who don't want to be able to spread their wings and have complete control over the entire space, the totality of Jerusalem, even not just old Jerusalem, but the totality of Jerusalem. That is a religious fact, I think, in a way that there really aren't facts at all in the context of the totality, not just of America, but of like either America, of like both continents. There's just nowhere that is even remotely parallel to Jerusalem. So like, sure, I'm a liberal, right? I believe fundamentally that having states where religion matters, states where ethnicity matters, is a dangerous way to approach state building. But it is a reality of the people who live there, and a reality of the land that exists there, in a way that it just isn't anywhere else.
Yeah, I acknowledge it. I just don't see it being the optimal option. Like it is the reality of the situation, and with conservative Israeli politics, the hope is to eventually sequester so much that a two-state solution is impossible, and so that the international community comes together and just helps like Palestinians settle elsewhere or what have you. Like that's what it looks like to me from the conservative political side.
I would push back on that. I think that the desire that has been made quite clear to bring in French Jews, the desire to bring in Russian and Ukrainian Jews, the desire to bring in Jews from across the globe. I mean, they try to bring American Jews, which, to be clear, American Jews are the best off Jews in the history of the world, right? I'm very happy in America. I have no plan to leave.
Everybody knows that Brooklyn guy that was taking someone's house, so like we know.
But so like. The desire is pretty clear that they want to bring in so many Jews that they can allow back all of the Palestinians and still be a Jewish majority. I think that's like that is the.
I don't think that's the ultimate goal of people like Bibi. I don't think that's the ultimate goal.
I think it is.
No, because now Now, this, of course, this is an outsider perspective. This is based on like a few documentaries and letters and what have you, meetings or whatever. There's a PBS documentary, frontline documentary series called BB at War that explores Benjamin Netanyahu's youth through his. I think it was released in 2017, so up until 2017, his entire political career, and for a lot of those people, and I said this earlier, for a lot of those people, Arabs already have their state. It's Jordan. They should all just go to Jordan. And I think that is the ultimate goal for those politicians and people that have that kind of mentality. I'm not saying that it is. I gotta fix my bots. But I'm not saying that is the majority of people in Israel want this. I'm saying that is what a large portion of the people that are seeking political power want. And I think that you see credence with that, with what you had said, with the wanting to bring all the Jewish people from everywhere into Israel, as well as the occupation, but the settlements. I think that is part of it, because you're taking more and more land and housing away from Palestinians and sequestering them in smaller areas.
I don't understand how settling somewhere kicks people out. How does that work? Like,
so if you
for goodness, most of this is a desert, right? Like, most of this land is not
what was happening
densely populated.
You're creating densely populated areas for Palestinians to reside in. I think it is that I think it's the West. I want to say it's the West Bank, but either West Bank or Gaza is one of the most densely populated areas in
Gaza.
the world.
Gaza is, yeah.
And as you encroach more and more on that, and you encroach more and more on that territory, and you more and more people live there, they lose the property that they had, and so they're forced to go into more and more dense urban housing, and it's creating a situation where you have pockets of areas where you essentially can't create a Palestinian state. Like,
So there's two places that we're talking about. We're talking about Gaza, which there's an Israeli disengagement from Gaza in 2005, right? So there used to be 21 Israeli settlements in Gaza. Yeah. There are no longer. They were literally all of the infrastructure that the Jews had that these Jews had created in Gaza were forcibly removed, and all of these people kicking and screaming, some of them using guns, were forcibly taken out of Gaza and thrust back into Israel proper. So there aren't Jews in Gaza today. They're just as a factual matter, there aren't. There are 471,000 Jews living in the West Bank. Okay. And one of those places is extremely densely populated, and that is Gaza. One of those is not densely populated in the same way. Yes, Bethlehem is densely populated. Yes, there are examples of cities that are densely populated in the West Bank, but the majority of the land prior to 1947 or 1948 rather was not densely populated. It's just not true. And there are 4 million people living in the totality of Palestine, both of Gaza and in the West Bank, and I don't know that 4 million Jews living in the West Bank is an attack on Palestinians living there.
It's not an attack on Palestinians living there, but as more land is given to Jewish settlers, there's less land available for creating a viable Palestinian state. And I think that is what the goal there is, to make it to where there isn't a possible Palestinian state. So they have to accept that Israel controls everything. I think that is the goal of some of these politicians.
Okay. I don't necessarily disagree with that. Yeah, I think that probably is the goal. Probably yes, it is likely the goal of someone like Bibi Netanyahu to control the totality of Israel Palestine, not Gaza. I don't think anyone wants Gaza. Egypt certainly doesn't want Gaza. Israel doesn't want. No one wants Gaza. Gaza is a mess. And I feel awful for the people of Gaza, particularly given the fact that Hamas controls them. But when we're talking about the West Bank, like, I guess I'll just ask you, do you think that if there are to be these two states, that it's crucial that these two states be of the same size?
It is crucial that they both have access to the Dead Sea for desalination and access to water. It is crucial that they have access to port city. It is not crucial that they be the same size, but they have to be continuous. I think if you don't have continuous territory, you have ethnic enclaves that create issues. Where we settle in Azerbaijan recently, so I think that is more crucial of it. And for a two-state solution to actually exist, for a two-state solution to be viable, I think it's going to take more than just what's happening between Israel and Palestinians, or Israelis and Palestinians. I think it's going to take the larger Arab world coming together and being like, okay, we want to fix this. Absent of that, it's likely either going to be a Jewish, for lack of a better term, ethnic state, or it's going to be a continuation of what we see now of just constant bloodshed and fighting, and unless the Palestinians somehow manage to take over, and then it will be a Palestinian ethnic state through laws and regulations and that sort of thing.
Yeah, you're describing some pretty hellish circumstances.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, like, I think that, well, I'll just pose it this way. Do you think that it would be a tragedy? Do you think it would be an ethnic cleansing? Do you think, whatever words you want to use, if it simply was all part of Israel being a Jewish majority country, but a country that is welcoming of Muslim minorities within it, one that has Muslims in their government, all of that?
It would have to actually be a liberal state. Elsewise, then you have issues buttressing up against ethnic.
How are you defining that?
I would say, for example, I was against the passage of the Jewish nationhood law that happened recently. I don't think that I think there's an issue with marriage where Palestinians can actually get married, or Israelis can't legally marry Palestinians, or stuff like that. All that stuff would have to go.
Disgusting. Yep.
All that stuff would have to go away. They would likely have to be the recognition of multiple languages as the official language, because you have such a huge problem with that. I mean, even the U.S. doesn't have an official language, despite the fact that everybody speaks English, but you have pockets of people that do business with Spanish and other languages, especially after the 1960s with that whole thing with God, I don't remember what they exactly called it, but in California and in New York, recognizing that people should have a right to petition their government in the language that they natively speak in order to be fully integrated as citizens. So I think that it has to happen. There would have to be, it's a lot of stuff. I would say that it would probably have to allow Palestinians that are currently living as refugees either the right of return and or money so that they can actually get established and get established in the countries they are, because they're treated like shit in those refugees camps. None of the countries that they're currently refugees on have like full integration with that. They're not all fully integrated.
It's worth pointing out that is an intentional decision, right? It's worth pointing out that Jordan, particularly in the case of Jordan, but in the case of all of these countries, that it is very intentional that these people have been kept in camps for, at this point, 70 years, whatever the hell it's been. Yeah. And so, that is not an accident that they're still in those camps. It is not an accident that they have not been allowed to be part of the society again. But yeah, go on.
Yeah, no, I for clarity of the viewers, I am aware of that. Thank you for telling the viewers that, because that's something we didn't mention. But that is one of the reasons why I think Palestinians are becoming their own ethnicity, separate from Arabs, because of how badly treated they've been by everybody in this situation. You almost have 100-year history, so that's 3 generations of people being treated as an other by everyone, and that is the easiest way to create a different ethnicity, is by otherizing people. That's why in the case of America, black people, despite black people have their own culture within the United States due to segregation, oppression, slavery, etc. And I think the same thing is slowly happening to Palestinians for similar reasons. So yeah, I think they would have to either allow the right of return or fully established in those countries. I don't know how that would happen. It's a very tricky situation, but yeah, it's going to it's going to be difficult. Sorry, maybe just me just asked if there's going to be news night. No, news roundup is Thursday still. This is something special that I set up so Quibbles and I could, or Jonah and I could talk about this. But please, you can respond.
Yeah. So you put down a lot of things that are sort of prerequisites. That's a lot of prerequisites. I don't think that is going to happen in our lifetime. All of the things that you described. Well, actually, I shouldn't say that. I think that much of what you've just described is likely to happen in our lifetime within the confines of Israel proper. So when you're describing things like, the marriage issues, huge problem, absolutely disgusting, has to be changed. I think that will change in the next 30 years. Whether it's going to happen in the next 10 is an open question, but I think it will happen in the next 30. When we talk about the issues like, the right of return, I think that actually might happen in the next 30 years because increasingly the number of Jews is large enough that even right-wing Jews within Israel proper are less concerned now than they were at the birth of the nation, that it becomes a Muslim majority state. And so I think that the willingness to allow politically for that return is increasing. Whether or not that's going to be a one-state thing, I just can't see it. I don't necessarily want to see it, to be honest, because I don't think that one state it should be in control of the top of the Temple Mount, because I think that one state being in control of the Temple Mount, if it is like, this is antithetical to everything I stand for as a liberal, but I just don't believe ever that there will be secular control over the Temple Mount, any part of the Temple Mount.
I think that's, and if there's not secular control, if there's not the recognition that it has to be basically set up in the way it is, with neither religion being able to dominate the other within the space, then you're just going to keep having these problems, because that becomes a religious identity schism.
Yeah, I agree.
And that it's just going to perpetuate the problems. So I don't.
I'll just ask you, does secular control of the top of the Temple Mount mean that you build a Jewish temple? Which means that you have to take down the Dome of the Rock?
No, it means that you have it, just leave it as it is. Like, it is his, you leave the Temple Mount, you leave the Wailing Wall as that they are, and just have them recognize that, hey, shit happened, and this is what it is now. Because if we try to fix it or do anything else, we're just going to piss people off, and it's going to cause tensions.
Does secular control mean that women are able to pray at the totality of the temple of the Wailing Wall, or does it mean that they're segmented to a proportion of it?
I think that in this case there can be reasonable religious accommodations made, similar to what is made in the U.S., where they have to where the religions themselves can control the different parts of whatever it is. To be honest with you, I'm not religious, so me personally, it's not important to me.
Yeah.
So
this is my concern. They're like, okay, there are Jews who want to archaeologically dig out much of the temple beneath, right? Which fundamentally threatens the structure of literally the third most holy site in Islam. A religion of, what is it, 1.3 billion people, right? It's a huge number of people who are Muslim. It's gigantic, right? So I want to say that, of course, you should be able to dig out that archaeologically, because I want to be able to say that, of course, that is a crucial component of Jewish history. It's a crucial component of history of the world, even, that there is vital information from a historical perspective, vital information from a religious perspective. I want to be able to say that. I can't. And there's no way to get around that without just talking about it from a Muslim. Someone's asking something in the Twitch chat. What are they asking?
I know. I just saw that.
Just that they're Muslim. Okay.
I think it's,
yes.
How do you pronounce it? I don't know. They just followed.
So yeah, you can't have a conversation around what happens beneath the Dome of the Rock without talking to Muslims in the context of Islam. You can't talk about what's happening literally on top of the temple, the ruins of the temple, without talking to Jews from a religious context. Everyone hears this from a religious lens.
Right.
There's no one who's having this conversation. So yeah, secular control is never going to happen.
Well, or just recognize that what it is now is the reality of what it is, and stop trying to change like the way that the structure, who controls what, like cement that and make it to where you can't excavate it, you can't change the rules on what happens on top, and you just cement that inside whatever the controlling body is, the government or what have you.
Do you think it's fair that
the status quo, like what is going on there?
Do you think it's fair that I can't pray on top of the Temple Mount?
No, it's not fair, but
I shouldn't say fair. Do you think that it is just? Do you think that it is a good thing that I can't pray on the top of the Temple Mount?
I think that it is a necessary injustice in order to keep peace. It is a utilitarian thing in order to prevent anything happening. And then over time, maybe those things will loosen because of the interaction with people, because of in this theoretical one state solution that is under liberal control, eventually that will influence the religions and the people that live there, and maybe they'll care less about it.
Yeah, I just don't think ever that we're going to get to a point that people care less about this. People have cared about this since before Islam was a thing. People have cared about this before Christianity was a thing. People have cared about this place really since not even the birth of Judaism, since prior to the time of Judaism as now conceived.
They may still care about the site, but they may care less about the complete segregation of the site. So over time, as more interaction happens, maybe they'll loosen up the rules and allow more coexistence, so to speak, to take place within this after a couple of generations of living under a more just and liberal order.
I just don't buy it.
It might not happen, but if you care about preventing violence, which I'm sure everybody that's involved in these conversations ultimately want to prevent.
Well, that's what the Holy Sepulchre has done, right? The Holy Sepulchre, there's not been violence really since the Crusades around the Holy Sepulchre. And the Holy Sepulchre, the way that they do that is that they have very segmented control over. I mean, there's a famous example of there's a I'm not sure if it's still up, but for hundreds of years there was literally just like a normal ladder that was sitting in the Holy Sepulchre, in one of the most crucial components of all of Christianity, because there were like 15 different organizations that all would have had to give permission to change the location of this ladder that was sitting in the middle of the Holy Sepulchre. And they couldn't all agree on where to move this ladder. And so this ladder sat there for hundreds of years because everyone was arguing about where to put the ladder, right? And I think that is the closest that you can get. Is that pathetic? Of course it's pathetic. Yeah. But is that the best that you can possibly do when there are all of these different sects of Christianity? Yes. And that's just within a Christian site, right? Only Christians care about the Holy Sepulchre. That is not like the Dome of the Rock on top of the temple, right? like this is such a complicated thing, and it's such a mess. And I just don't think that secular solutions are a real solution. Yeah.
I just think that I think what would end up happening is that you would end up having a recognition that each person, as said before, each religion controls its own thing, and then they recognize that the status quo is what it is, with how the Dome of the Rock is, with how the Wailing Wall is, etc. And so that they don't push to take those away from the rest of the religious people on the other side. And then over time, that will create camaraderie potentially. It will create
probably not.
It might not. But I'm saying that we can't know, and right now that's the best solution.
Yeah, I think we can know that it will not create camaraderie. I mean, we can look at the Holy Sepulchre that has been jointly controlled for what has it been, 400, 500 years at this point? But
it creates managed discord though, not violence.
Okay.
So
That's a fair point.
it would be an improvement, and I'm saying potentially after all the integration and things that happen under a one state, whatever you want to call it, Israel, Palestine. I don't care what the state is called. It's not like, I'm going to be honest, like it doesn't matter to me because it's not my bag. It's not my. I don't have a dog in this fight other than from a humanist perspective. But whatever ends up being the state, eventually that might, go down to the culture, and then that will improve situations. We did have I'm terrible at pronouncing.
I'm going to go with Zakov.
Okay, Zakov. Yeah. Asking, why do you, I'm guessing he means me, Americanize Islam? Is that a kind of new colonization where you're imposing your way on the life of us? We have the right to self-determination. We will come to our own conclusions and discoveries. Every group of people have their own have their right to self-determination, in my opinion. However, I am not a cultural relativist. If I think something is moral, then I'm going to tell other people that I think it is moral and that they are immoral or wrong or doing an unjust action or carrying out a thing. And that is me respecting them as not necessarily as basically an equal. If I wouldn't talk down to anybody, not even a child, about these kind of things, might talk to them in a way they understand, but I wouldn't sugarcoat it or say that they're doing the right thing because I'm not a cultural relativist. So that is my position on that, Shakov. I don't know what Jonah's position is on that.
Yeah, my position is that if we mean by Americanize, don't fucking kill people, I'm in favor of Americanizing. If what we mean by Americanizing is that we need to have American flags, which we literally do on top of the Temple Mount, which is absurd. We shouldn't. Yeah, we should get rid of that. If we're talking about Americanize as in, military control, if we're talking about Americanize as in Western Western control as in like literally like Western governance, rather than Westernizing as in like Westerners are allowed to be there. Westernizing as in like, minorities are allowed to be there. One of those things is really important. And I think the Hajj is a great example of, I have a hell of a lot of problems with Saudi Arabia, like a hell of a lot of problems with Saudi Arabia. But to their credit, they have done a better job than could be expected of allowing both Sunni and Shia, of allowing minorities within Islam to perform the Hajj, broadly speaking. And I think that is a thing that should be lauded and admired in them. Because I think it's extremely difficult, and I think that it's fair to be concerned about this becoming a military site or a colonial site, because it has been a colonial site in the past. But I don't think that is an argument against access, universal access. I also want to point out to Warthog, to Terrell, whatever the hell. I'm terrible at Twitch names. I can never read them. Okay, I'm just going to read it. I think that we should make one state solution, so all groups around the world know that terror and genocide are 100% okay, as long as you create an anti-Semite card to create victimhood. I don't know what you've been listening to, but I don't think either of us have said that. I think that terror and genocide are awful, obviously. And even if you're the victim of terror and genocide, that doesn't mean that you can thereby defend perpetration of further genocide to protect yourselves. My point is simply that when I talk about anti-Semitism, I'm talking about Jews don't get a right to live there. Jews don't get a right to live there is very different than Jews don't get the right to force people out from there, right? If you're saying that Jews have a right to force Muslims out of there, that makes you an Islamophobe. But if you're saying that Muslims have a right to force Jews out of there, that makes you an anti-Semite. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, and Warthog Turret is also said, don't kill people. America is one of the most guilty global powers for abuse over the last 70 years. If we don't like a leader, we remove them. Yes, and that should stop too. I don't think that.
Yeah, I don't know either of us.
Jonah or myself is for necessarily immoral actions. I like I said, but I'm not a cultural relativist. If the only choice is between if the only choice was between USSR and America leading the world, I'm going to pick America. But that's because I don't agree with what the USSR did either, and I think they were a worse party. That doesn't mean I agree to everything that the American government did from Vietnam to Iran to Cuba to South America, every single state in South America to Korea. It doesn't mean I agree with every action that was taken. It just means that I didn't agree with the USSR. So.
Yeah, Warthog is saying more nonsense. So yeah, I am saying no. I'm curious about it. I don't want you to nuke them because I am curious about this. I'm saying Jews aren't special. No special rights for the Jew card. The chosen people claimed ended in 70 AD. So okay, let's unpack this a little bit. I don't know why saying that you have a right to live in your ancestral homeland means that you're claiming that you're special. I think that Native Americans have a right to live in America. Does that mean that Native Americans are somehow special? I think that the Kurds have a right to live in Syria. Does that make them special? I think that Baha'i or the Druze have a right to live in both Jordan and in Israel, right? They are genuinely of the place. And so I don't know why that makes you a chosen people, right? So from a religious context, there is a covenant that Jews believe to be between Jews and God that is distinct from the covenant of non-Jews with God. That is true. Just as similarly, Christians claim to have a particular covenant with God and a particular covenant with Jesus. Just as Muslims claim to have a particular covenant. Just as any number of religions claim to have a particular relationship with God that other people don't. But I don't know that suggesting that because Jews call ourselves the chosen people in terms of our relationship with God, that is an argument from a political perspective, that we're suggesting that we're a chosen people from a political perspective, that therefore, because we're the chosen people, I'm not even really sure what exactly it is that you're proposing. But it concerns me.
Yeah, I'm not sure exactly. This is bordering on anti-Semitism.
I agree with that.
I'm going to call you out on this, Warthog turret. There are ways to talk about this issue without bringing this up. I am also a secularist, so I don't agree with any of this whole chosen people things. But that's my own personal thing, and if somebody wants to believe that they are, that's on them. As long as they don't violate the rights of other people, I don't care. That's what we're actually talking about in this conversation, is whether or not the rights of others should be or should not be violated in order to create a state or two-state solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. That is where this conversation actually is. I don't know when you joined us. I think you joined us on the later end of the cast. So there you go. That is where I'm coming from on this. There was another comment here by Shakov. Didn't mean the war. I speak about the cultural influence. They found, e.g., organizations for women's rights or homosexuals, although this is against Sharia, which is kind of a law in the Islamic world. Okay, so yes, as I stated earlier, I understand where you're coming from more now. I don't think that your religion gives you the right to violate other people's bodily autonomy. I don't think it gives you the right to impose your own ideological religious bent on them, and therefore I think it is wrong for Muslims anywhere in the world to try to force their views on others, and what have you, make homosexuality illegal, make gay marriage illegal, make sodomy illegal, make any kind of sexual relationship between any people illegal. I think these are things that are morally wrong. And I'm going to tell you that. Does that mean I think the U.S. or some other government should come in and force you to be a liberal? No. But I'm just going to say that I think you're wrong.
Yeah, to Steelman Zakov or whatever it is. I do think that there's a conversation that is worthy to be had about the way that prayer should happen in the most holy sites. So the example that I would come to is the obvious one of the Wailing Wall. At the Wailing Wall, women are only have access to like maybe a third of the part that you can see, and there's also an underground component that's on the men's side that women don't have. That's sort of like inside of what was the temple, and it is the closer side to the temple, the holiest of holy, in the middle of the temple, than on the women's side. And that is something that as a liberal, I obviously want the ability to pray with my sisters and my mother at the temple, because of course I do, because that's what I want as a liberal. But I don't think that it's necessarily crazy to be thinking about that as a component of the people who take this to be a very serious site. And I don't think that it's crazy that there is a desire for prayer to be separate, and that is a similar concern among on the top. It is a similar concern to be thinking about like when and where should different forms of the religion be permitted. And so I think that if the concern that was being voiced there is a concern around sort of secularization, not secularization, but sort of liberalization to the extreme, liberalization meaning that like everyone should be permitted in every place. This is not a tourist attraction. This is not something like. Do I want to be able to go into the Dome of the Rock because I think it's beautiful? Yeah, of course I do. I'm an architecture nerd. Of course I want to. But I don't think that like I should be able to just do the Hajj, or I should be able to just like, wander into any room that I want in the Holy Sepulchre and just like take some photos with my iPhone. Like there's a degree of respect and nuance here that I think is worth thinking about. At this point, Warthog is just saying a shit ton of anti-Semitism, which is interesting, and I think is worth thinking about as like a thing that constantly comes up with this conversation. But yeah, okay, that's all right.
Well, in that case, I'm going to mute him. I'm going to ban the person because to be honest with you, I don't know enough about in particulars of Jewish faith to recognize this stuff, but I can mute him for the duration of the conversation so it doesn't bleed.
Well, actually, no, I kind of.
You want to? I kind of do want to. If you're okay with it,
I kind of want to.
Okay.
Yeah, the thing is that I think that like, wow. Okay, so I'm going to read through this. Okay, so you aren't the chosen anymore. You failed the calling. You were clearly replaced by Christians. We, the Christians, are the chosen. The chosen status is to teach the world about monotheism. That's not, to clarify, at all what it means to be the chosen people, even remotely. The chosen people is the chosen people as in the covenant was between God and the chosen people and the people that God chose. So it is to say the 12 tribes, because those are the people who were brought out of slavery in Egypt. Those are the people who were chosen in that context. This is the idea of like coming down from the mountain with the commandments. The chosen people is about not just a relationship that the people have with God, but a relationship that God has with the people. But that is the basic premise. The idea that Christians are this like new chosen status, that may very well be the Christian teaching, and I don't think that it's crazy or disrespectful to Jews to be talking about the Christian teaching. But I do think that it is a little bit disrespectful to suggest that because Christianity exists, that therefore there is no space for Judaism. That falls into very dangerous and anti-Semitic territory very quickly. So Jews refused that calling and were kicked out because, and then he goes on to say, Jewish evangelists was attempted in Greece until the Greek people started usurping the holiness of the Jews. At which point the Jews created a false term, Hellenistic. The most holy site, you found an ark. The holy site isn't holy without the ark. So to clarify, that's just wrong, completely wrong. Like they're absolutely. So one of the reasons that there's a desire to do archaeological digs underneath the Temple Mount is because there absolutely 100% were multiple temples built there. There's no question about the fact that there were multiple temples built there. There's no question about the fact that there were Jewish priests that were living there. There's no question about the fact that there were, many thousands of sacrifices that were done there. There's no question that this history goes back literally well in excess of 5,000 years, probably more in excess of 6,000 years. There's no question about like any of that from an archaeological perspective. You're just like flatly wrong there. And then he says, this crowd, you need the ark to evoke the spirit of God. No ark, no tent of meaning. Third temple can't happen without an ark unless it's another fake temple. So apparently the temples are fake. Like, this is absurd. I have studied Torah for 20 years. I very much doubt that. I am more Jewish than you, Jonah, despite the fact that he previously called himself Christian. Crimea River, yeah. I feel like we've reached the end of what's valuable from Warthog.
Well, and as I said in chat, I am not knowledgeable enough about the in particulars of pretty much any religion. I've broad-based studied all religions in college and for the political perspective, but that doesn't mean I understand all these in particulars. So I do not want to have this conversation anymore. So Warthog Turret, please stop. I don't want to ban you or mute you, but this is not anything that we are going to address anymore, so I'm just going to ignore it going forward. To Shagah's point about the organizations and telling Muslims they need to respect women, etc., everybody has the right to tell everybody else what they think is the correct moral thing to do. They don't have the right to impose that on other people from outside, and that is the last comment I'm going to say about that as well. So yeah, let's see. There was one thing and I got distracted from all the chatting. Let me see. Let me think for a second. Okay. So so this is the last point that I want to make about this topic, and then we can, wrap it up or whatever. There's always an issue between, shush. Sorry, my dog just barked. There's always this issue of, whether or not the right of people have the right to self-determination, and also whether or not there is the free exercise of religion buttressing up against the freedom of association. So in these particular instances, I know I kind of rambled there for a second, but I'll bring it in a little bit. So in these particular situations, I think that to Jonah's point that he made earlier about the Jewish people being able to control their site in a way that is holy to Jewish people, the Muslim people being able to control their holy site, which is in a way that is holy to the Muslim people. I think freedom of association permits those things to happen within a liberal context. So if a group of people control the Dome of the Rock, control the Wailing Wall, control Al-Aqsa, and every other kind of holy site, they have the right to make the rules that pertain within there, but not necessarily within the governments at all. And I think that is the compromise that you can achieve. And I don't think that's illiberal to have that as a thing, because freedom of association is a thing. You can't force others to associate with people. So if a religious organization controls the areas, then they have the rights to make the rules within those areas, just not on the broader society as a whole.
I think that is potentially reasonable. I think that my concern is there's almost a definitional built-in security risk with all of these places. And so there's going to be a question. There's sort of like multiple frameworks of ownership that are going on. There's the literal, like on paper, who owns these sites? And there are answers to those questions, obviously. But the question of like who literally owns it at some level is sort of a tertiary question comparative to the question of who is the one who literally controls it. Who's the one who literally is the guy with machine guns who is stopping people from shooting each other there? And the answer is going to be Jordan, Israel, or some Palestinian state. Or the UN, but the UN is a terrible answer. So like, those are the answers. Those are the answers. From a military perspective, those are the answers. And if we're suggesting a single state, presumably this state is if we're suggesting that it's a Jewish majority state, which is what we were discussing earlier, what we're describing is that Jews control the top of the mountain. And that's what we're describing. From a military perspective, that's what we're describing. Sure. And so even if it is a respectful framework of ownership, of control, not of ownership, but of control, there will still be an undercurrent, a correct undercurrent among the people who are on the top of the Temple Mount, wherein they are there but by the grace of this Israeli state, but by the grace of the Jews. And that creates tension in a way that I think is unnecessary, and that can be avoided if it be controlled by a Muslim military.
Yeah, I don't know if that's a thing that can actually be resolved necessarily, and it might just be one of those things that, for lack of a better way, has to be tried to know how it's going to play out. And if there is legal recognition of these sites in the particular makeup that makes sense to each individualized religion within the state's new state's constitution, I think that could alleviate some of the fears. Not necessarily the hardliners, but if the hardliners are made even more of a minority than they already are, then I think it could work. So.
Yeah, I think that's. I mean, again, I think you're just as a general thing. I think that you're more utopian in relation to this than I am. But
well, I mean, it makes sense. I'm not connected to it in any intimate way or even culturally. So
I guess that's fair. Yeah, I don't know. All right. Just before I end, the one thing that I will point out, I don't think that it's random that we were brigaded by sort of, it wasn't just Warthog, but it was also Bradge Walk, whoever it was, but a number of people came in at the end there and were spouting anti-Semitism. I don't think that that's random. I don't think that it's random that I don't think that you fall into this, but I think there are a lot of people who use... Yeah, go for it.
No, I'll let you finish, and then I'll clarify Brad, because he's actually defending us here. So because I know him
okay. Oh, I got you. Yeah, I apologize for maligning Brad there. But I don't think it is random that there is a undercurrent of anti-Semitism. I think that a lot of times there is anti-Zionist sounding words that are not actually anti-Zionism. They're ultimately just anti-Semitism. But it's something that has been used in a way to cloud that and to make it unclear to people who I think are acting in good faith, because they're sort of they're hiding their anti-Semitism in this framework in a way that can be utilized in a way that's more beneficial than just outright saying, like, you are not fully human, like, you control the banks, whatever the fuck it might be. But
right. And Brad, I did quickly, I don't know how far behind you are or what the gap is here, just for reiteration. Jonah, I know Brad, he's actually part of the community that I help run. Okay. He was commenting on a different account while he was watching it on YouTube. He just switched over for whatever reason. And yeah, he apologized. He told you to fuck off, and he's like, "Oh, I'm sorry," after he caught up. So yeah, it's just the chat was moving quickly, and it just, like, if you don't see the whole conversation, then it's gonna appear one way that it's not. So, but yeah, I think that wraps it up. Jonah, I greatly appreciate you joining me on this cast. This was a great conversation. I hope I was able to explain my position better.
Sure.
And this was probably the most respectful conversation I've had with anybody that's been wedded to an issue on this and knowledgeable about it without coming to blows. And I greatly appreciate that.
All right. I appreciate it as well. It was fun. Do we want to talk about something else, or are we good for the night?
I actually have to walk my dog, so I'm actually going to head out.
Cool.
So yeah. But
right.
Go ahead and shout yourself out and tell people about yourself again, and I'll wrap it up.
Yeah, for sure. We are, let's see if I can do it. Wait, I got it on this side. No shit, I got this. We are Quibbles Over Coffee. If you go to Quibbles Over Coffee, if you search that on YouTube, you will find Quibbles Over Coffee. And then you can have some coffee and you can listen to us quibble about a variety of subjects, whether it be this one or whatever it might be on the given day.
All right.
All right.
Again, Jonah, thank you so much for joining us. If this is your first time enjoying the Crowdsourced Politics podcast, I'm the host and moderator, Cypher here. We typically do a news roundup every week, Thursdays at 8 p.m. Eastern. It goes on for about 2 hours, where I and others hopefully recap the news that was for the week with the kind of analysis only the crowd can provide. These segments here, where I'm talking with people like Jonah and others, are hopefully a thing that's going to happen more often, where we're going to have conversations and also Oxford-style debates, kind of a little different thing than you're used to seeing on Twitch and YouTube with these debates. So I'm hoping to do that more often. Jonah, you are more than welcome to come on either the news show or having another one of these conversations. If you were, just go ahead and hit me up on Twitter, Discord, wherever.
Awesome. All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jonah.
See you.
And so everybody, that's a wrap. Please go ahead and hit that follow button. It really does help us out for the algorithms. If you are so inclined, we do have a donate or a support link. If you are so inclined, it's the best way to help support the cast. We do have pay for web hosting and podcast hosting, so we can get on all the podcast streaming services out there. We are currently on pretty much everything. You can catch us on YouTube, Twitch, iTunes, Spotify, Google, Podbean, iHeartRadio, etc. So go ahead and check out the podcast. It's a really good time and it has a lot of good information. And as always, keep your head up through the political storm.